Hi guys, welcome to the next video in our series in the lesson for regulation of arterial blood pressure and the reflexes. In this video we're going to talk about the baroreflex in quite a bit more detail, and in particular what we're going to talk about is how to fill out this chart, which is known as a CIRCSIM chart. Okay, and you guys have an entire computer lab which is dedicated to filling out this chart and figuring out what the responses are to various changes in the cardiovascular system, okay? And we're going to go through an example of hemorrhage later in this video. This is a concept map which describes the baroreflex in some detail. Initially, as you're learning to figure out what the reflex response is on balance and what it does to all these parameters in the first column, I'm going to ask you to use this concept map. Now, a lot of you, you will not have this on the exam, and a lot of you are going to say, I'll just jump ahead and I'll just do it without the concept map because they're just little wussy concept maps, and I don't really need that. I'm a brainiac, I'm in med school, and I don't need to use any map to figure out what happens with the baroreflex. My response to the vast majority of you who think that way and who want to just sit down in the computer lab and just start doing it is you are probably making a mistake. My experience tells me that you are smart and you are a smart medical student, but you're going to want to at least initially use this map. Okay? So I'm going to walk you through a problem in a minute. So you'll notice this chart. We have our parameters here. IS is inotropic state. CVP is central venous pressure, SV is stroke volume, HR is heart rate, CO is cardiac output. Arterial resistance is total peripheral resistance, and MAP is mean arterial pressure, and these are the symbols used on the map. We have three columns. DR stands for direct response, so I'm going to explain to you what these are in a minute. RR stands for reflex response. SS stands for steady state. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, here's our mean arterial pressure, and here's time. And at this point here, I do something. Let's say I give blood, and I get a decreased blood volume or something. And whatever that something is, it decreases the mean arterial pressure. Okay? The response to that something, in the absence of a reflex, is called the direct response. It is what happens to the system just in response to whatever perturbation you introduced, okay? The reflex response is what your body does in order to correct that problem. And so if whatever that is decreases mean arterial pressure, you will initiate a reflex, in our case the baroreflex, to bring that mean arterial pressure up back toward normal, okay? And we've been talking a lot about what's involved there, all right? So the direct response is what happens to the system when you don't think about the reflexes. The reflex response is the response of the system which tends to bring the mean arterial pressure, in this case, back up toward normal. Okay? Now, we diagram these separate, like they're both separate phases, but the reality is that both take place at the same time. As soon as your mean arterial pressure starts to drop, your reflex response kicks in and starts to bring that mean arterial pressure back up. But it is useful for us, when we're trying to figure out what's going to happen, to consider these separate, okay? So we consider the direct response first, what happens without the reflex response, then we consider the reflex response second, and what happens in order to bring the mean arterial pressure back toward normal, okay? And that's what DR and RR mean. Steady state is where you end up. After these are over and they've done what they're going to do, the mean arterial pressure that you end up with. And you will note that in the case of the mean arterial pressure, and in fact in the case of most regulated variables, you do not get all the way back up to where you started. You get close, but you don't get back all the way. And that is true the majority of the time. Okay? That's always true for our purposes, for CIRCSIM problems, and when we consider these reflexes in the cardiovascular system, it's always true, okay? And it's true for the vast majority of reflexes that you will run into throughout your studies. There are rules for filling out a concept map. I'm not going to go through these. If you feel like they help you, read through them and use them, okay? I generally do not use them. I'm going to walk you through the way that I think about this. But if you want to use the rules, okay? They work. So now I'm going to walk you through a CIRCSIM problem. And this problem will be what happens to your cardiovascular parameters when you lose a half a liter of blood, which would be something like giving blood, okay? So the tricky part of this for most people is figuring out where to start, okay? We're going to start with the direct response, but we have to start with a change in one of these variables. And the change in one of these variables is going to initiate changes in all the rest. So figuring out what changes first is your first challenge. So you're hemorrhaging and you're losing blood. And I told you guys the vast majority of your blood is in the venous system. And so when we consider what happens when we give blood and we lose half a liter of blood, we usually think that, well, we're losing, the vast majority of that blood's coming out of the venous system. We're losing venous blood. So we usually start with a decrease in central blood volume, that is the blood in the veins, the volume of blood in the veins of the great veins of the chest and in the atrium. And that causes a change in central venous pressure, which is on our chart. So the initial change, we say, is a decrease in central venous pressure. Okay? Decreased blood volume, most of the blood's in the veins. You lose the blood from the veins, you get a decrease in central venous pressure. Okay? That leads to consequences in terms of the cardiovascular system. Your central venous pressure, you know that's an indication of how much your heart is filling. It's an indication of preload. We went through this as in the heart as a pump lesson. So if I decrease central venous pressure, I decrease preload, I decrease stroke volume. And stroke volume goes down, and I have a decrease here in my chart. If I decrease stroke volume, well, cardiac output is stroke volume times heart rate. So if stroke volume drops, cardiac output drops. So I'm going to follow my arrow and go directly to cardiac output. Cardiac output goes down, okay? And if my cardiac output goes down, then my mean arterial pressure will drop, follow the arrow. And we know that because mean arterial pressure is cardiac output times total peripheral resistance. If this drops, this has to drop, okay? So our mean arterial pressure has dropped, okay? And there it is right there. And now we ask ourselves, do I have any reason to believe that any of these other parameters change as an effect of the direct response, that is, no reflexes yet? Just because I've lost blood, will my arterial resistance change? The answer is no. There's no reason why it will change. The heart rate won't change. It's under the auspices of the autonomic nervous system. The nootropic state won't change. The contractility won't change because it is also changed by the autonomic nervous system. And nothing that we did here indicates that you should be changing any of these parameters in the direct response. Now, so that's the end of our direct response, and what we'll ordinarily do here is we'll check to see if the changes in our parameters are consistent with our causal relationships. So my mean arterial pressure dropped. If my mean arterial pressure drops, that means that one of these two parameters on the left-hand side had to drop. Arterial resistance did not change, but cardiac output dropped, so my mean arterial pressure went down. So I'm good there. Cardiac output is stroke volume times resistance. If the cardiac output dropped, that means one of these had to drop. And if I look, heart rate didn't change, but stroke volume did drop, so my cardiac output, it's okay for it to be down. So our causal relationships hold, and that is a check that we can do to see if our answers here are at least correct in that respect. If they're not correct, if you get a drop here and neither one of these dropped, that means you did something wrong. Okay? One of these two has to drop if this dropped. One of these two has to drop if this dropped. Okay? So that's a check on yourself when you get through with that column. All right, so we initiate our baroreflex from there. That's our reflex response. Decreased MAP, decreased impulses to the brain, we get a change in the opposite direction in our arterioles and our total peripheral resistance. We get vasoconstriction, increased sympathetic output, vasoconstriction, increased total peripheral resistance in response to the decreased impulses to the brain. Okay, and TPR, arterial resistance, goes up here. Okay. From there, we go to mean arterial pressure, and our mean arterial pressure rises back toward normal because our TPR went up. Okay. The next step in our baroreflex is a change in heart rate. Okay. We do arterial resistance first because arterial resistance has the biggest effect on mean arterial pressure, generally speaking. A small change in arteriolar radius gives you a big change in resistance. And so we get a big effect here on mean arterial pressure with a small change in radius. So we do this first. It's the most powerful effect on pressure. Okay. The next thing we do is heart rate. And again, decreased impulses to the brain, increased heart rate, a change in the opposite direction, and that will increase our cardiac output. And you'll notice we did this before we did the change in inotropic state. Heart rate is the biggest effect on cardiac output, okay, bigger than inotropic state, so we consider that first. And an increase in heart rate means an increased cardiac output, right? Cardiac output equals stroke volume times heart rate. And now, if we look, we increased cardiac output, increased MAP, but the MAP is already up because of the vasoconstriction, so you don't have to worry about that. But look here, we also have this additional arrow. We have this minus sign here where increased cardiac output decreases central blood volume and decreases central venous pressure. That is the effect of your vascular function curve. Remember your vascular function curve, increased cardiac output, decreased venous pressure. Okay? And so when the cardiac output goes up, we say our central venous pressure falls. And if our central venous pressure falls, our preload falls and our stroke volume falls. Okay? And we get a decrease in stroke volume. And this is a point of constant confusion with students. They go, you're trying to increase your cardiac output. Why in the world would you want stroke volume to fall? And the answer is you don't. But your body doesn't care about stroke volume. Does not care. All it cares about is mean arterial pressure. And as long as that's going up, it does not care what happens to stroke volume. And if stroke volume falls as a result of what you had to do to get that pressure up, in this case vasoconstrict, and more importantly in this case increase the heart rate, then it falls. And your stroke volume goes down, your cardiac output is still high because your heart rate's high. Okay, and it's the predominant factor. It's the factor that counts the most when we think about cardiac output. Okay, so stroke volume falls, cardiac output's still going up. Okay, all right. And then lastly, the last effect we think of in terms of the baroreflex, decreased impulses into the brain, a change in the opposite direction with a minus sign, an increase in inotropic state, an increase in contractility of the muscle. And the increased contractility helps limit the fall in stroke volume. So we usually think increased contractility, increased stroke volume, but preload has the biggest effect on stroke volume. It is the most powerful effect. And so that is the reason why we do it first when we follow our concept map. The concept map is set up so the most important parameters are considered first. So you do these in order. The increased inotropic state, your stroke volume is still falling because your preload is falling, but what it does is it limits the fall, and it helps that fall not be quite so severe, so big, okay? All right. So we've got our reflex response here. Let's check our causal relationships. We have an increased mean arterial pressure, so that means either cardiac output or total peripheral resistance must have gone up, and both actually went up, so that's good. So that's consistent with our causal relationships. Cardiac output, if that goes up, stroke volume or heart rate must have gone up, and in this case, heart rate went up. So that's okay, that is consistent with our causal relationship. Stroke volume fell, but that's okay. One of these two has to go up in order for it to be consistent. So that check holds, and it's an indication that we did it right. It's not 100%, but if that check doesn't hold, then we know we did it wrong. All right. So now we've considered our direct response and our reflex response. Now we add them up. And we go, okay, at steady state, where do we end up? So the first thing I always do is I fill in mean arterial pressure, because as I indicated on the last slide, this is our regulated variable, and it will always end up slightly in the direction of the direct response, because your reflex response will bring it back up, but you don't actually quite get back to where you started. So mean arterial pressure is down, okay, slightly down. And what you do is you start to look at your parameters from there. So if you look at inotropic state, no change in the direct response, an increase in the reflex response. So the inotropic state must be higher than where you started, okay? The direction of change was increase in reflex response. It didn't change at all in the direct response. So the net direction of change is high. It's up. It's higher than where you started. For central venous pressure, the direction of change was down in the direct response, and then it dropped further in the reflex response. So we know that that's going to be down compared to where we started. Okay. The stroke volume. Dropped in the direct response, dropped further in the reflex response. It will be down in the steady state. Okay. The heart rate did not change in the direct response. The direction of change was up in the reflex response, so our heart rate is up compared to where we started. Okay. Note that these two are direction of change, and then you try to figure out what level you're going to end up at when you add these together and look at what's going to happen on balance. Now, if we look at cardiac output, we got a little problem here, because it's down in the direct response and it's up in the reflex response, and we really don't know which way to go, so we'll leave that one blank for now. And we'll go to arterial resistance, which did not change in the direct response, went up in the reflex response, so it must be up at steady state. And it's up. So we've got everything in our column here except cardiac output, where we didn't know which way to go. So here's again where our causal relationships might come in handy. So I don't know what to do with cardiac output. So maybe I can look at stroke volume and heart rate and figure out what direction to go in. So heart rate went up, but stroke volume went down. So cardiac output could go either way. Okay, we don't really know. So that doesn't really tell us anything, because it could go either way, because one went up and one went down. If they had both gone down, cardiac output must be down. If they had both gone up, cardiac output must be up. Okay, but they didn't. So let's look at our next causal relationship. Mean arterial pressure down, TPR up. So what must have happened to cardiac output? If this is down, one of these two has to be down. TPR is up, cardiac output must be down. Okay? Whoops, see, there you go. I highlighted it, and now we're using this one. Cardiac output must be down, because one of these two has to be down if this is down. And since this is up, this one must be down. Okay? And now we filled out our table. And we've got our response diagrammed the way that it should be diagrammed. So this is a typical problem of this type. I think you can see the utility of it if you were to look in first aid for the USMLE Step 1. You will find tables like this, where they actually ask you to put the direction of to tell them what will happen to these parameters, these types of parameters, in response to an increase in sympathetic outflow, or in response to some sort of perturbation to the system. So this is not a waste of your time, and I do suggest that you come to the lab and you work through the problems. All right, so that's all I've got for this video. Like I said, you do have a lab with these sorts of problems, and I do encourage you to come. Having said that, I will post answers to the lab, and the programs are always available, as all my programs are, for you to do it if you wish, but I do strongly suggest that you come to the lab. I'll be circulating, Dr. Morgan will probably be circulating, and we will be there to answer your questions over this and help reinforce some of the concepts. This can be fairly complicated depending upon what problem you're addressing, And so I think you'd be glad you came. All right, thank you for your attention.